The morning light filtered through the chapel windows as organ music filled the sacred space with hope and celebration. I sat in my car across the street, still in my dress blues, watching my younger sister Emma walk down the aisle in the most beautiful gown I'd ever seen. Through the open doors, I could see our family gathered inside, laughing, crying tears of joy, and sharing in what should have been one of the happiest moments of our lives. What they couldn't see was me, Captain Sarah Mitchell, decorated combat veteran, sitting alone in a parking lot because I wasn't welcome at my own sister's wedding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rejection still burned in my chest like shrapnel I couldn't dig out. 3 weeks earlier, my stepfather Richard had made it crystal clear that my presence would ruin Emma's perfect day. "You're a distraction, Sarah," he'd said, his voice dripping with the same disdain I'd heard for 15 years. "This day is about Emma and her future, not about your military theatrics. Find somewhere else to be." My mother had stood behind him, silent as always, her eyes pleading with me not to fight back, not to make waves, not to cause the scene that might shatter the fragile peace she'd worked so hard to maintain. But this story didn't begin with a wedding invitation I'd never receive, or a family that chose sides long before I understood there was a war being fought. It started in a small house in Millbrook, Oregon, where I learned that love could be conditional and family could be a battlefield where only some soldiers were allowed to fight. I was 8 years old when my father died in a construction accident, leaving my mother Rebecca to raise me alone. For 2 years, it was just us against the world, and despite our struggles, those were some of the happiest memories of my childhood. Mom worked double shifts at the diner, and I spent afternoons at Mrs. Patterson's house next door, doing homework at her kitchen table and learning to braid friendship bracelets while she told me stories about her late husband's service in Vietnam. She was the first person to plant the seed that would eventually grow into my military career, telling me that some people were called to serve something bigger than themselves. Everything changed when Richard Blackwood entered our lives. He was a successful insurance broker with a house in the suburbs, a steady income, and what my mother called stability. At 10 years old, I didn't understand why we needed his stability when we'd been doing just fine on our own. He was polite enough during their courtship, bringing flowers for Mom and small gifts for me, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at me that felt cold and calculating, like he was measuring my worth and finding me lacking. The wedding happened quickly, a small ceremony at the courthouse that I barely remember except for the way Richard's smile never quite reached his eyes when he promised to love and care for both of us. We moved into his house in Riverside Heights, where the lawns were perfectly manicured and the neighbors drove cars that cost more than my mother had made in an entire year at the diner. I should have felt grateful for the bigger bedroom, the better school district, and the financial security that Richard provided. Instead, I felt like an intruder in a world that had no place for a girl who preferred climbing trees to tea parties and asked too many questions that adults didn't want to answer. Richard made it clear from the beginning that his house had rules, and those rules applied especially to me. No running in the hallways, no noise during his evening news program, no friends over without advance permission, and absolutely no mention of my biological father. That man is gone. He told me one evening when I'd asked why we couldn't visit Dad's grave on his birthday. "I'm your father now, and you need to accept that and move forward." When I protested that he wasn't my father and never would be, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. My mother quickly intervened, pulling me aside to explain that Richard was trying his best, and that I needed to show more gratitude for everything he was providing for us. The birth of my half-sister Emma when I was 12 changed the dynamic of our household completely. Suddenly Richard had the child he'd actually wanted, and I became even more of an unwelcome reminder of my mother's past. Emma was perfect in his eyes, with blonde curls and blue eyes that matched his own, a sweet disposition that never challenged his authority, and a natural grace that I seemed to lack entirely. I loved Emma from the moment she arrived, but watching Richard's face light up when he held her, while barely acknowledging my existence in the same room, was like being stabbed repeatedly with tiny needles. As Emma grew older, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. Her artwork covered the refrigerator while mine was politely moved to my bedroom. Her dance recitals were circled on the family calendar, while my track meets were forgotten until the last minute. When Emma wanted a puppy for her 8th birthday, Richard surprised her with a golden retriever named Princess. When I asked for guitar lessons that same year, he explained that money was tight, and perhaps I should focus on more practical skills. The message was clear. Emma was the daughter worth investing in, and I was the obligation he'd inherited when he married my mother. High school brought new challenges and deeper rifts in our family structure. I threw myself into athletics, joining the cross-country team and later the JROTC program, finding solace in the discipline and camaraderie that military structure provided. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like my dedication and hard work were valued and recognized. Colonel Martinez, our JROTC instructor, became the father figure I'd been missing, teaching me about honor, duty, and the satisfaction that came from earning respect through merit rather than birthright. Richard hated my involvement in JROTC almost as much as he hated my growing independence. All this military nonsense is filling your head with ideas. He'd complain to my mother when I'd come home late from training exercises or leadership camps. She's getting too big for her britches, thinking she's some kind of soldier. What she needs is to focus on finding a husband who can provide for her, not playing dress-up in camouflage. His words stung, but they also fueled my determination to prove him wrong, to show him that I was capable of achieving something meaningful with my life. The breaking point came during my senior year when I received a full ROTC scholarship to Oregon State University. It was the culmination of 4 years of hard work, excellent grades, and leadership positions that had earned me recognition from military recruiters across the state. I was proud, excited, and ready to finally escape the suffocating atmosphere of Richard's house. When I announced the news at dinner, expecting at least some acknowledgement of my achievement, Richard's response was swift and brutal. "Absolutely not," he said, setting down his fork with enough force to rattle the plates. "No stepdaughter of mine is going to embarrass this family by playing soldier. You'll go to community college, study something practical like nursing or teaching, and find yourself a nice young man to settle down with. This military fantasy ends now." When I protested that the scholarship was my ticket to independence and a career I was passionate about, he stood up from the table, his face red with anger. "As long as you live under my roof, you'll follow my rules, and my rule is that you're not joining the military." End of discussion. My mother's silence during this exchange was deafening. I looked to her for support, for some indication that she understood how important this opportunity was to me. But she kept her eyes fixed on her plate, unwilling to challenge the man who provided our financial security. That night, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could surrender my dreams to keep.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Peace in a family that had never really accepted me. Or I could fight for the future I wanted, even if it meant walking away from the only family I had left. The decision should have been difficult, but it wasn't. The next morning, I called Colonel Martinez and accepted the scholarship. That afternoon, I packed my belongings while Richard screamed about ungrateful children and disrespectful behavior. Emma, now 10 years old, watched from her bedroom doorway with tears in her eyes, not understanding why her big sister was leaving or why Daddy was so angry. I knelt down and hugged her tight, promising her that I loved her and that this wasn't goodbye forever, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Why can't you just do what Daddy wants?" she whispered into my shoulder. "Why do you have to make everyone so upset?" I didn't know how to explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes doing the right thing means disappointing the people you love, that sometimes courage requires choosing a difficult path over an easy one. Instead, I told her that I was going to become someone she could be proud of. Someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. My mother drove me to the bus station in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. As I grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk, she finally spoke. "He's not a bad man, Sarah. He just wants what's best for you, in his own way." I looked at her, this woman who had once been my hero, who had worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after Dad died, who had taught me to be strong and independent. Now she seemed small and afraid, more concerned with maintaining Richard's approval than supporting her daughter's dreams. "What's best for me, Mom, or what's easiest for him?" I asked quietly. She couldn't meet my eyes as she drove away, leaving me standing alone with my bags and my determination to build a life that no one could take away from me. It would be 3 years before I saw any of them again, and by then, everything would be different. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who judged me on my abilities, rather than my relationship to someone else. The ROTC program was demanding, pushing me physically and mentally in ways that revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. I excelled in my studies, earned leadership positions, and developed friendships with fellow cadets who shared my commitment to service and excellence. When I graduated with honors and received my commission as a second lieutenant in the Army, I felt like I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. My first deployment to Afghanistan came 2 years later, and it was there that I truly understood what Colonel Martinez had meant about serving something bigger than yourself. Leading soldiers in combat, making life and death decisions under pressure, and experiencing the bonds forged in shared danger taught me lessons about courage, sacrifice, and honor that no classroom could have provided. I was good at it, respected by my peers and superiors, and recognized for my leadership abilities in ways that would have seemed impossible to the insecure teenager who had left Richard's house years earlier. The Army became my family, my identity, and my home. Through multiple deployments and steady promotions, I built a career that I was proud of, surrounded by people who valued dedication, integrity, and merit above all else. When I made captain at 28, it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked towards since that first day in Colonel Martinez's JROTC classroom. I had earned my place in a world where respect was given based on what you contributed, not who you were related to. It was during my third deployment that I received the call that changed everything. Emma, now 22 and finishing college, had gotten engaged to her longtime boyfriend Marcus. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and she wanted me to be her maid of honor. "I know things have been complicated with our family," she said, her voice crackling through the satellite connection. "But you're my sister, and I can't imagine getting married without you there." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe our family could find a way to bridge the gaps that had divided us for so long. That hope was shattered 3 weeks later when Emma called back, her voice thick with tears and barely controlled emotion. "Sarah, I'm so sorry, but Daddy says you can't come to the wedding. He says it would cause too much drama, and that he won't have his daughter's special day ruined by family conflict." Mom agrees with him, and Marcus's parents are very traditional and wouldn't understand having someone in the military in the wedding party. "I tried to fight for you, I really did, but they're paying for everything, and they said if you come, they'll cancel the whole wedding." The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I'd received in combat. After years of believing that my achievements in the military would eventually earn me the respect and acceptance I'd always craved from my family, I discovered that nothing had really changed. I was still the unwanted reminder of my mother's past, still the inconvenient stepdaughter who didn't fit into Richard's vision of the perfect family. The fact that Emma, whom I loved more than anyone in the world, had chosen their financial support over my presence at her wedding felt like the final confirmation that I would never truly belong in their world. I could have fought harder, could have demanded that Emma stand up to Richard and choose her sister over his money. But I also understood that she was caught in an impossible situation, torn between loyalty to the sister who had helped raise her and obedience to the father who had provided for her entire life. So I made the decision that I thought was best for everyone involved. I told Emma that I understood, that I wanted her to have the perfect wedding she deserved, and that our relationship was more important than any single day or ceremony. But understanding and accepting are two different things entirely. As Emma's wedding day approached, I found myself struggling with emotions I thought I had left behind years ago. The Army had taught me to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission at hand rather than dwelling on personal disappointments. But this wasn't a military operation I could strategize my way through, or an enemy I could defeat with superior tactics. This was my family, and despite everything that had happened between us, they still had the power to hurt me in ways that enemy fire never could. 2 days before the wedding, I made a decision that surprised even me. I requested emergency leave, booked a flight home to Oregon, and rented a hotel room in Millbrook. I told myself that I just wanted to be nearby. that maybe I could see Emma privately before or after the ceremony, that perhaps there was still a chance for some kind of reconciliation. But deep down, I think I knew that I was coming home to face the ghosts that had haunted me for 15 years. To finally confront the family that had never quite figured out how to love me. The night before Emma's wedding, I drove past the house where I had grown up, past the perfectly manicured lawn, and the white picket fence that had always felt more like a barrier than a welcome. The lights were on in the living room, and I could see figures moving around inside, probably making last-minute preparations for the big day. For a moment, I considered walking up to the front door, ringing the bell, and trying one more time to find my place in their lives. But I knew that my presence would only create the drama that Richard was so desperate to avoid, and I couldn't bear the thought of ruining Emma's happiness for the sake of my own need for acceptance. Instead, I spent the evening walking through downtown Millbrook, visiting the places that held memories of happier times. The diner where my mother had worked before marrying Richard was still there, though under new management. Mrs. Patterson's house next door to our old apartment sat empty, a for sale sign swaying in the evening breeze. The high school where I had discovered my passion for military service looked smaller than I remembered, but the flagpole where we had raised the colors every morning during JROTC still stood proud and tall. As I stood there in the gathering darkness, looking up at the flag that had inspired me to dedicate my life to serving my country, I realized that coming home had been the right decision after all. Not because I expected my family to suddenly welcome me with open arms, but because I needed to see for myself how much I had grown and changed since leaving this place behind. The insecure teenager who had once desperately craved Richard's approval was gone, replaced by a confident officer who had earned her place in the world through her own efforts and achievements. The morning of Emma's wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings and happy endings. I put on my dress blues, not because I had any intention of attending the ceremony uninvited, but because wearing my uniform reminded me of who I had become and what I had accomplished despite my family's lack of support. The ribbons on my chest told the story of my service, deployments, commendations, leadership positions that Richard had once dismissed as military theatrics, but that represented years of dedication, sacrifice, and growth. I drove to St. Mark's Episcopal Church an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, parking across the street where I could see the guests arriving but remain invisible myself. It was torture and comfort all at once, watching my extended family gather to celebrate Emma's happiness while knowing that I was deliberately excluded from their joy. I saw aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, cousins who had grown up and started families of their own, and family friends who had once been part of my life before Richard's influence gradually pushed me to the margins. Emma arrived in a white limousine, looking absolutely radiant in a dress that took my breath away. My mother fussed around her, adjusting her veil and making sure everything was perfect, while Richard stood nearby looking proud and paternal in his expensive suit. For a moment, watching them together, I could almost forget the years of conflict and disappointment. They looked like what they had always wanted to be, a perfect family celebrating a perfect moment, unmarred by the complications that my presence would inevitably bring. The ceremony began right on time, and I found myself crying as I watched my baby sister walk down the aisle toward her future. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the pain of being excluded from this moment, I was genuinely happy for her. Emma deserved all the love and joy that life could offer, and if my absence was the price of her perfect day, then it was a price I was willing to pay. But as the minister began the ceremony, something unexpected happened. He paused in his opening remarks and looked out over the assembled guests with an expression of gentle authority. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel, "I'd like to acknowledge someone who should be here with us today but isn't. Emma has spoken to me many times about her sister Sarah, and how much it means to her that Sarah has dedicated her life to serving our country and protecting our freedoms." My heart stopped beating. Across the street, sitting in my rental car, I felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Through the open chapel doors, I could see Richard's face turning red with anger, and my mother looking around nervously. But the minister continued speaking with calm determination. "I've been contacted by several members of this community who know Captain Sarah Mitchell, and who believe that her service and sacrifice deserve recognition, especially on this day when her family is celebrating new beginnings. Captain Mitchell, if you're listening somehow, if you're out there, please know that your sister loves you, and that your service to our nation honors us all. Then came the words that changed everything. Captain Mitchell, please stand. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the rental car. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, amazingly, people began to stand. First one guest, then another, then entire rows of people rising to their feet in acknowledgement of my service and my absence. Through the chapel doors, I could see my extended family looking around in confusion and growing understanding, could see Richard's face purple with rage, could see my mother covering her mouth with her hands. And then Emma did something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Still in her wedding dress, still holding her bouquet, she walked to the chapel doors and looked directly across the street to where I sat frozen in my car. Our eyes met across the distance that had separated us for so many years, and she raised her hand in a small wave that was part greeting, part apology, and part invitation. I don't remember getting out of the car or crossing the street. I don't remember walking up the chapel steps or entering the sanctuary where my family waited. What I remember is Emma running toward me, her wedding dress trailing behind her, and throwing her arms around me in a hug that erased years of hurt and disappointment in a single moment. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my shoulder as the congregation continued to stand in acknowledgement of my service. "I should have fought harder for you. I should have insisted that you be here. I love you so much, and I'm so proud of who you've become." Behind her, I could see Richard standing rigid with fury, my mother crying tears that might have been joy or relief or regret, and Marcus smiling with genuine warmth as he realized that his bride had just found the courage to do what she should have done months ago. The minister approached us with a gentle smile and an outstretched hand. "Captain Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. Emma has told me so much about you, and I hope you'll consider staying for the ceremony. After all, a bride should have her sister by her side on the most important day of her life." The invitation was simple, but the implications were enormous. Staying meant facing Richard's anger, dealing with family drama, and potentially ruining the perfect wedding that Emma had planned for months. But it also meant reclaiming my place in my sister's life and refusing to be invisible any longer. I looked at Emma, still beautiful in her wedding dress, still glowing with happiness, but now also fierce with determination to include me in her special day. "Are you sure?" I asked quietly. "This is your wedding, and I don't want to cause problems or make things difficult for you and Marcus." Her answer came without hesitation. "You're my sister, and I want you here. If anyone has a problem with that, they can leave." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of emotions and small miracles. I stood beside Emma as her maid of honor, still in my military dress blues, while she exchanged vows with Marcus. Some guests whispered among themselves, clearly surprised by the unexpected turn of events, but most seemed genuinely pleased that the family rift was being mended. Richard remained stony-faced throughout the proceedings, but he didn't make a scene or storm out, perhaps recognizing that doing so would cause exactly the kind of disruption he had tried so hard to avoid. My mother approached me during the reception, her eyes red from crying but her smile genuine. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said simply. "I should have stood up for you years ago. I should have insisted that you be included from the beginning. I was so afraid of conflict, so afraid of losing the stability that Richard provided, that I forgot what was really important. Can you forgive me?" It wasn't a complete reconciliation, and there were still years of hurt that would take time to heal, but it was a beginning. Even Richard eventually approached me, though his apology was grudging, and came only after several pointed conversations with other family members who had expressed their displeasure with my exclusion from the wedding. "Perhaps I was too hasty," he said stiffly. "Your military service is commendable. Emma obviously values your relationship, so I suppose we should try to find a way to coexist as a family." It wasn't the warm acceptance I had once craved, but it was progress. The real triumph came later in the evening when Emma pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that I've learned something important today. she said, taking my hands in hers. I've learned that family isn't just about keeping peace or avoiding conflict. It's about standing up for the people you love, even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something. You've been doing that your whole life, fighting for what you believe in, serving something bigger than yourself. I should have been fighting for you too. As I drove back to my hotel that night, still wearing my dress blues, still processing everything that had happened, I realized that this story wasn't really about a wedding at all. It was about finding the courage to claim your place in the world, about refusing to be invisible or apologetic for who you are, and about the power of standing up for what's right, even when no one else will stand with you. The minister's words had given me permission to exist in my own family's story again, but it was Emma's courage in crossing that chapel to embrace me that had made it possible. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see clearly what family members have become blind to, and sometimes it takes a public moment to force private conversations that should have happened years ago. I returned to my unit the following week with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of what it means to serve with honor. The Army had taught me to be strong, disciplined, and dedicated to something greater than myself. But my family had taught me that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the places we call home, not against enemy soldiers but against the prejudices and fears that divide us from the people we love. Today, Emma and I talk regularly, and our relationship is stronger than it's ever been. She's pursuing a career in social work, inspired partly by what she calls my example of standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Richard and I maintain a cordial but distant relationship, and while we'll never be close, we've found a way to coexist peacefully for the sake of family harmony. My mother and I are slowly rebuilding our bond, working through years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. But the most important lesson I learned from that day isn't about family reconciliation or personal vindication. It's about the responsibility we all have to stand up for what's right, to speak for those who have been silenced, and to refuse to accept exclusion and discrimination as the price of keeping peace. Minister Thompson didn't know me personally, but he recognized injustice when he saw it, and chose to use his platform to address it publicly. His courage gave me permission to step out of the shadows and claim my rightful place in my sister's celebration. There are others out there right now, people who have been excluded from family gatherings because of who they are or what they've chosen to do with their lives. Military members who have been rejected by families who don't understand their calling. LGBTQ individuals who have been uninvited from weddings because their presence might make conservative relatives uncomfortable. Children who have been written out of family stories because they chose different paths than their parents wanted them to take. If this story resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in the struggle to be accepted for who you are, rather than who others want you to be, know that you are not alone. Know that your worth isn't determined by whether your family recognizes it, that your achievements don't require their validation to be meaningful, and that sometimes the family you choose through shared values and mutual respect is stronger than the family you're born into. But also know this: reconciliation is possible when people are willing to do the hard work of honest conversation, genuine apology, and changed behavior. My relationship with Emma is proof that love can overcome years of hurt when both parties are committed to healing. My gradual détente with my mother shows that even deeply damaged relationships can be repaired with patience and forgiveness. The minister who called my name that day taught me that sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to see clearly what family members have become blind to. He used his position of authority and respect to shine a light on an injustice that everyone else had chosen to ignore. In doing so, he gave my family permission to see me differently, to recognize that excluding me had been wrong, and to take steps toward making things right. That's the power each of us has in our own communities, in our own circles of influence. When we see someone being excluded or marginalized, when we witness injustice being perpetrated in the name of keeping peace, we have a choice. We can remain silent and complicit, or we can speak up and demand better. We can choose to see the excluded person's worth and to insist that others see it too. Captain Sarah Mitchell stands today not just as a military officer who has served her country with distinction, but as a daughter and sister who refused to be erased from her family's story. The uniform I wear represents more than just military service. It represents the decision to dedicate your life to something bigger than yourself, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, and to never accept that some people matter less than others. My story didn't end with that wedding ceremony. It began there, with the recognition that I had always been worthy of love and inclusion, that my family's failure to see my worth didn't diminish it, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. The minister's words gave me permission to be visible again, but it was my own choice to step out of that car and claim my place in my sister's celebration. Every day, in small ways and large ones, we all have opportunities to be that minister for someone else, to see the excluded, to name the injustice, and to use whatever platform we have to demand better. To stand up for the military members who have been rejected by families who don't understand their service. To speak for the children who have been cast out for choosing their own paths. To insist that everyone deserves a place at the table, especially at the celebrations that matter most. That's the real message of this story. Not that every family conflict can be resolved with a single gesture. Not that all wounds can be healed with one conversation, but that we all have the power to refuse to be invisible, to insist on our own worth, and to create the change we want to see in our families and communities. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as someone calling your name and asking you to stand, giving you permission to be seen and valued for who you truly are. The sound of applause still echoes in my memory from that day, not just for my military service but for the courage it took to keep serving despite being rejected by the people who should have been proudest of my achievements. That applause was for every excluded person who has ever chosen to keep striving, keep achieving, and keep believing in their own worth, even when the people closest to them couldn't see it. Today, I continue to serve my country with pride, knowing that my uniform represents not just military values but the personal values that have guided me through every challenge. Integrity, perseverance, and the refusal to accept that some people matter less than others. My family relationships continue to evolve and heal, built now on a foundation of mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. And somewhere out there, someone else is sitting in a car across the street from their own family celebration, wondering if they'll ever find their place in the story. To that person, I want to say this: your worth isn't determined by whether they see it. Your achievements don't require their validation to matter. And sometimes, if you're willing to be brave enough to step out of the shadows, you might discover that there are more people ready to stand up for you than you ever imagined possible. The minister called my name that day, but the choice to answer, to cross that street, and to claim my place in my family's story was mine alone. That's the choice we all have, every day, to remain invisible or to step into the light, to accept exclusion or to demand inclusion, to let others define our worth or to insist on defining it ourselves. Captain Sarah Mitchell answered that call, and in doing so, discovered that coming home isn't about returning to a place that never really wanted you. It's about bringing your whole self, your achievements, your growth, and your hard-won wisdom back to the people who need to see what you've become. Sometimes they surprise you by standing up and applauding, and sometimes that applause changes everything. The weeks following Emma's wedding felt like stepping into an alternate reality, where the family dynamics I had known my entire life suddenly shifted in ways I never thought possible. The phone calls started 3 days after the ceremony, tentative at first, then growing more frequent and genuine as time passed. Emma called every other day, sometimes just to chat about mundane things like her new apartment with Marcus, or the challenges of merging 2 households, but often to ask deeper questions about my military service and the experiences that had shaped me during our years apart. "I keep thinking about how different things could have been," she said during one of our evening conversations, her voice carrying a weight of regret that broke my heart. "All those years when I could have been learning from you, looking up to you the way little sisters are supposed to. Instead, I let Daddy convince me that your choices were somehow wrong, that wanting to serve your country was selfish or attention-seeking. I was such an idiot, Sarah. Such a coward. I found myself in the unexpected position of comforting the sister who had excluded me from the most important day of her life just weeks earlier. You weren't a coward, Em. You were trying to survive in a complicated situation, trying to keep peace in a family that had some pretty dysfunctional dynamics. You were a kid dealing with adult problems, and you did the best you could with what you knew at the time." But Emma wasn't satisfied with my attempts to minimize her guilt. "I wasn't a kid when I got engaged, though. I was 22 years old, old enough to stand up to Daddy and insist that my sister be included in my wedding. I knew it was wrong to exclude you, Sarah. I knew it, but I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than doing the right thing. I was protecting my own comfort instead of protecting our relationship. These conversations became a lifeline for both of us, a way to bridge the gap that had widened over the years as we had grown up in different worlds shaped by different expectations and opportunities. Emma began asking me about my deployments, about the friends I had lost in combat, about the weight of making life and death decisions under pressure. She wanted to understand not just what I had done during my military service, but who I had become because of it. "Tell me about Afghanistan," she said one evening, and I could hear her settling in for a long conversation. Could picture her curled up in the corner of her new couch with a cup of tea and that focused expression she had worn as a child when she was trying to understand something important. "Tell me what it was really like. Not the sanitized version you probably gave Mom and Daddy over the years, but the real story. I want to know who my sister really is." So I told her about Lieutenant Rodriguez, barely 23 years old, who had stepped on an improvised explosive device during a routine patrol and died in my arms while I tried desperately to stop the bleeding. I told her about the Afghan interpreters who had risked their lives to help American forces, many of them younger than she was, who understood better than most civilians the true cost of freedom. I told her about the schools we had helped build, the medical clinics we had protected, the small victories that never made the news, but that meant everything to the people whose lives were touched by them. "I used to think military service was about fighting and killing," Emma admitted after I had shared some of the more difficult memories. "Daddy always talked about it like it was violence for the sake of violence, like people who joined the military were just looking for an excuse to hurt others. I never understood that it was really about protecting people, about standing between innocent civilians and the forces that would harm them. I never understood that you were risking your life so that people like me could sleep safely at night." The education went both ways. Emma told me about her college years, about studying social work because she wanted to help families in crisis, about the domestic violence shelter where she had volunteered, and the children she had worked with, who reminded her, she said, of herself growing up in a house where fear and tension were constant undercurrents. She had chosen her career path partly because of what she had witnessed in our own home, though she was only beginning to understand the full impact of Richard's emotional abuse on our family dynamics. "I used to think Daddy's anger was normal," she confessed during one of our longer conversations. "I thought all fathers yelled at their wives and stepdaughters, that all families had this undercurrent of tension, where everyone was walking on eggshells trying not to set off the person who controlled the household. It wasn't until I started dating Marcus and spending time with his family that I realized how different things could be. Marcus, I learned, came from a family where disagreements were handled through discussion rather than intimidation, where love was expressed through support rather than control, where children were encouraged to pursue their dreams even when those dreams differed from their parents' expectations." Emma's exposure to healthy family dynamics through her relationship with Marcus had begun to open her eyes to the dysfunction she had accepted as normal throughout her childhood and adolescence. "Marcus couldn't understand why I was so nervous about bringing up the subject of inviting you to our wedding," Emma explained. "He kept saying that of course my sister should be there, that it would be weird not to include you. When I tried to explain Daddy's objections, Marcus looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He said his parents would never dream of excluding one of his siblings from a family celebration, no matter what kind of disagreements they might have had in the past." It was through Marcus's family that Emma had begun to understand what unconditional love looked like, what it meant to belong to a family that celebrated rather than punished individual achievement and independence. His parents had welcomed Emma warmly from the beginning of their relationship, but they had also asked pointed questions about why her sister wasn't part of their engagement celebrations or wedding planning process. Their gentle but persistent inquiries had forced Emma to confront the reality of my exclusion in a way that Richard's justifications and my mother's silence never had. "Marcus's mom asked me directly why you weren't going to be in the wedding," Emma told me. "She said she couldn't imagine getting married without her sister standing beside her, and she wanted to understand what kind of family conflict could be serious enough to justify excluding a close family member from such an important celebration. When I tried to explain Daddy's reasoning, when I heard myself saying out loud that you were being excluded because your military service might make the wedding too political or controversial, I realized how ridiculous it sounded. It was Mrs. Chen, Marcus's mother, who had ultimately contacted Minister Thompson about my situation. She had heard enough about my military service and the circumstances of my exclusion from the wedding to recognize an injustice that needed to be addressed. As an immigrant who had worked hard to build a successful life in America, she understood the value of service and sacrifice in ways that Richard never had. She had also raised 3 children who had all chosen different career paths, and she couldn't fathom rejecting any of them for following their dreams and serving their communities. Mrs. Chen told me that in her culture, military service is considered one of the highest honors a person can achieve. Emma explained. She said that excluding you from my wedding because of your service was not just wrong, it was insulting to everyone who has ever worn a uniform to protect our freedoms. She asked me if I was proud of my sister's achievements, and when I said yes, she asked why I was allowing Daddy to prevent me from showing that pride publicly. The conversation with Mrs. Chen had been a turning point for Emma, forcing her to choose between the path of least resistance that she had followed throughout her childhood and the moral courage required to stand up for what she knew was right. It had taken her several days to work up the nerve to approach Minister Thompson, but once she did, she discovered that he had been harboring his own concerns about my exclusion from the ceremony. Minister Thompson told me that he had been praying about the situation ever since you contacted him to let him know you wouldn't be attending, Emma revealed. He said it didn't sit right with him that a military officer who had served her country with distinction would be excluded from her own sister's wedding, especially when the exclusion seemed to be based on prejudice rather than any legitimate family conflict. Minister Thompson, I learned, was a former military chaplain who had served 2 tours in Iraq before returning to civilian ministry. He understood better than most the challenges that military families faced, the sacrifices that service members made, and the ways that civilian families sometimes struggled to understand or appreciate the calling to serve in uniform. He had seen too many military members return from deployment to find that their families had grown distant or resentful during their absence, and he was determined not to let another service member be rejected by the people who should have been most proud of their achievements. He told me that he had been looking for a way to address your exclusion without overstepping his bounds as the officiant, Emma continued. When I came to him and asked for his help in finding a way to include you in the ceremony, he said it was an answer to his prayers. He had been planning to acknowledge your service during the ceremony anyway, but having my permission and support made it possible for him to be more direct in his approach. The planning that had gone into that moment when Minister Thompson called my name was more extensive than I had realized. Emma had provided him with details about my military service, my deployments, and my achievements, while Mrs. Chen had reached out to other community members who knew me through my high school JROTC program or through mutual military connections. By the time of the wedding, there were at least a dozen people in attendance who were prepared to stand when my name was called, who understood the significance of the moment and were ready to show their support. We weren't sure if you would actually be there, Emma admitted. We hoped you might be because we knew how much you loved me despite everything that had happened, but we weren't certain. Minister Thompson said that even if you weren't physically present, acknowledging your service and your absence would send an important message to Daddy and to everyone else in attendance about what our family's values should be. The revelation that my exclusion from the wedding had been a topic of discussion and concern for multiple people in our community was both humbling and empowering. For years, I had assumed that my family's rejection of my military service was a private matter, that most people either didn't know about the conflict or didn't care enough to get involved. Learning that there had been a network of support building behind the scenes, the people I barely knew had been advocating for my inclusion, gave me a new perspective on the power of community and moral courage. Mrs. Chen said something that really stuck with me. Emma told me during one of our conversations. She said that families don't just belong to themselves, that when a family mistreats one of its members, especially someone who has served the community or the country, it becomes everyone's business to speak up. She said that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in perpetuating it. This philosophy was foreign to everything I had learned growing up in Richard's house, where family business was supposed to stay private no matter how dysfunctional or harmful it might be. The idea that my exclusion from Emma's wedding was not just a personal disappointment, but a community concern that warranted intervention was both validating and overwhelming. It meant that my worth and my service had been recognized and valued by people who barely knew me, while the family that should have been most proud of my achievements had been willing to erase me from one of their most important celebrations. The aftermath of the wedding continued to reveal layers of support and advocacy that I had never known existed. Colonel Martinez, my old JROTC instructor, reached out to tell me that he had heard about what happened at the ceremony and wanted me to know how proud he was of the way I had handled the situation. Several of my former classmates contacted me through social media to express their admiration for my military service and their shock that my family had tried to exclude me from such an important celebration. "I always knew you were destined for great things," wrote Jennifer Walsh, who had been my lab partner in chemistry and my running partner on the cross-country team. "Even in high school, you had this quiet strength and determination that set you apart from everyone else. I've been following your military career through mutual friends, and I want you to know that our whole graduating class is incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. The fact that your stepfather couldn't see your worth says everything about him and nothing about you." Messages like Jennifer's came flooding in over the weeks following the wedding, from classmates, teachers, neighbors, and community members who had known me during my formative years and had been rooting for my success even during the long years when my own family had seemed indifferent to my achievements. Reading their words of support and encouragement, I began to understand that I had never been as alone as I thought, that there had always been people who recognized my potential and celebrated my accomplishments, even when my immediate family couldn't or wouldn't. The professional response to the wedding incident was equally surprising and affirming. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Barnes, called me into her office the Monday after I returned from leave to discuss what had happened. I had been prepared for a lecture about maintaining professional boundaries or avoiding family drama that might reflect poorly on the unit, but instead, Colonel Barnes wanted to express her admiration for the way I had handled a difficult situation. "Captain Mitchell," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. "I've been in the Army for 22 years, and I've seen too many outstanding officers struggle with family relationships that don't support or understand their service. What happened at your sister's wedding? The way that minister and your community stepped up to honor your service when your own family wouldn't, that's something special. That's the kind of recognition that every service member deserves, but too few actually receive." Colonel Barnes went on to tell me about her own struggles with family acceptance during her early career, about parents who had wanted her to choose a more traditional path, and siblings who had never quite understood her dedication to military service. She had been married and divorced twice, she revealed, both times to civilian spouses, who had ultimately been unable to cope with the demands and sacrifices that came with being married to a career military officer. "The Army becomes your family in ways that civilians don't always understand," she explained. "We depend on each other in life and death situations, we share experiences that most people can't comprehend, and we develop bonds that are often stronger than blood relationships. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt when your biological family fails to recognize the value of what you're doing or the person you've become through your service." Our conversation evolved into a mentoring session about balancing military career demands with personal relationships, about finding ways to maintain connections with civilian family members who might not understand military culture, and about building support networks that could sustain you through the inevitable challenges of a military career. Colonel Barnes shared resources for military families dealing with relationship conflicts, recommended books about bridging the civilian-military divide, and offered to connect me with other officers who had successfully navigated similar family dynamics. "The most important thing to remember," she said as our meeting concluded, "is that your worth as an officer and as a person isn't determined by whether your family recognizes it. You've proven yourself through your service, your leadership, and your character." What happened at that wedding, with the minister calling your name and the community standing to honor you, that's the recognition that matters. That's the validation of your service from people who understand what it means. The support from my military family was matched by growing understanding and acceptance from my biological family, though the process was gradual and sometimes awkward, as we all learned to navigate relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and conflict. My mother began calling more frequently, not just to exchange pleasantries but to ask real questions about my work, my future plans, and my perspective on family relationships. "I've been thinking a lot about the choices I made when you were growing up," she said during one of our longer conversations. "I know I failed you in many ways, Sarah. I was so focused on maintaining stability and avoiding conflict that I lost sight of what was really important." I let Richard's opinions and prejudices override my own judgment, and I allowed him to marginalize and dismiss you in ways that no mother should ever permit. These conversations with my mother were among the most difficult and healing experiences of the entire process. She began to acknowledge patterns of behavior that she had previously minimized or ignored, recognizing how Richard's need to control and dominate had infected every aspect of our family life. She talked about her own fears and insecurities, about feeling trapped in a marriage that provided financial security but emotional poverty, about convincing herself that Richard's treatment of me was somehow justified or necessary. I used to tell myself that he was just trying to toughen you up, that his criticism and disapproval would motivate you to work harder and achieve more, she admitted with obvious shame in her voice. I convinced myself that his rejection of your military ambitions was protective, that he was trying to save you from a dangerous and difficult career. But the truth is, I knew better. I knew he was being cruel and unfair, and I chose to enable him rather than stand up for my own daughter. The process of rebuilding our relationship required my mother to confront not just her past failures, but her ongoing patterns of behavior that prioritized peace over justice, harmony over honesty. She had to learn to express opinions that differed from Richard's, to support decisions that he disagreed with, and to maintain relationships that he didn't approve of. It was frightening for her, after decades of subordinating her own judgment to his, but it was also liberating in ways she hadn't expected. I've started seeing a counselor, she told me during one of our weekly phone calls, someone who specializes in helping women who have been in controlling relationships. I'm learning about things like emotional abuse and manipulation, about how gradually giving up your own voice and agency can happen so slowly that you don't even realize it's happening until you've lost yourself completely. Through therapy, my mother was beginning to understand how Richard's behavior toward me had been part of a larger pattern of control and dominance that had shaped our entire family dynamic. She was learning to recognize the ways that his criticism, demands, and emotional manipulation had created an environment where everyone walked on eggshells, where love was conditional on compliance, and where individual achievement was threatening rather than celebrated. Your counselor helped me see that what Richard did to you, the way he dismissed your dreams and belittled your achievements, that was emotional abuse, she said, with growing clarity and conviction. I participated in that abuse by staying silent, by failing to protect you, by choosing my own comfort over your well-being. I can't undo the damage that was done, but I can commit to doing better going forward. Richard's response to the wedding incident and its aftermath was more complex and contradictory than I had expected. In the immediate aftermath of the ceremony, he had been furious about what he saw as public humiliation and loss of control over the family narrative. He blamed Emma for orchestrating my inclusion, accused Minister Thompson of overstepping his bounds, and ranted about military members who thought their service entitled them to special treatment or recognition. But as weeks passed and the community response became clear, as friends and colleagues expressed their admiration for my service and their disapproval of my exclusion from the wedding, Richard began to moderate his position in ways that seemed motivated more by social pressure than genuine change of heart. He started mentioning my military achievements in conversations with neighbors and business associates, taking credit for my success in ways that would have been laughable if they weren't so infuriating. Richard's been telling people at the country club that he always supported your military career, Emma reported with obvious disgust during one of our conversations. He's claiming that the wedding situation was just a misunderstanding, that he's always been proud of your service, and that any suggestion otherwise is based on miscommunication or family drama that got blown out of proportion. This revisionist history was typical of Richard's approach to situations where his behavior had been publicly criticized or challenged. Rather than acknowledging wrongdoing or committing to changed behavior, he preferred to rewrite the narrative in ways that preserved his reputation and authority, while minimizing the impact of his actions on others. It was frustrating but not surprising, and it helped me understand that any reconciliation with Richard would be superficial at best. I'm not expecting him to suddenly become a different person, I told Emma when she expressed her own frustration with his attempts to rewrite history. I know who he is and what he's capable of, and I'm not going to waste emotional energy trying to win his approval or acceptance. What matters is that you and Mom are willing to build real relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. What Richard chooses to do or say about my service is irrelevant to me at this point. But even Richard's grudging and self-serving acknowledgement of my military achievements represented a kind of progress, a recognition that his previous strategy of dismissal and marginalization was no longer socially acceptable or personally sustainable. The community response to the wedding incident had made it clear that his treatment of me was viewed as inappropriate and shameful, and his attempts to rehabilitate his reputation required at least superficial acceptance of my worth and achievements. The most meaningful aspect of the post-wedding period was the deepening relationship between Emma and me, built on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect that had been impossible during our childhood years. We began making plans to spend more time together, to create new memories that could balance out the years of separation and misunderstanding. Emma and Marcus invited me to visit them in Portland, where they had settled after the wedding, and I was able to take leave time to spend a long weekend getting to know my new brother-in-law and seeing my sister in her new life. "I want you to be part of our future," Emma told me as we walked through the Saturday market in downtown Portland, sampling local foods and browsing artisan crafts. "I want you to know our children, to be the kind of aunt who shows up for school plays and birthday parties and graduation ceremonies. I want to build the kind of relationship that we should have had all along, the kind that Daddy's insecurities and prejudices prevented us from having when we were younger." The weekend in Portland was a revelation, showing me sides of Emma that I had never been allowed to see during our childhood years. Away from Richard's influence and expectations, she was confident, funny, and fiercely intelligent, with strong opinions about social justice issues and a commitment to her work with vulnerable families that reminded me of my own sense of calling to serve others. She had inherited none of Richard's prejudices or limitations, and she was building a life that reflected her own values rather than his expectations. "Marcus and I have been talking about starting a family in the next few years," Emma confided as we sat in a coffee shop overlooking the Willamette River. "I want our children to grow up knowing their Aunt Sarah, to understand that military service is honorable and important, to learn about courage and sacrifice and standing up for what's right. I want them to be proud of having a veteran in their family, not ashamed or confused about it the way I was for too many years." The prospect of being part of Emma's future family, of having the opportunity to be a positive influence in her children's lives, felt like a gift beyond anything I had dared to hope for during the dark years, when my relationship with my family seemed irreparably broken. It represented not just personal healing but the possibility of breaking the cycle of dysfunction and prejudice that had shaped our childhood, of creating a new family legacy based on acceptance, support, and unconditional love. As I prepared to return to my base after that weekend in Portland, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few short weeks. The wedding that was supposed to exclude me had become the catalyst for family healing that I never thought possible. The moment of public recognition that Minister Thompson had orchestrated had validated years of service and sacrifice in ways that went far beyond my family's belated acceptance. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had taught me that worth and dignity cannot be bestowed or withheld by others, that the value of service and sacrifice is inherent, rather than dependent on recognition or approval. The years I had spent proving myself to a family that seemed determined not to see my worth had been years spent chasing external validation that was ultimately unnecessary. My service record, my achievements, my character, and my contributions to my country and community were facts that existed independently of whether Richard acknowledged them or Emma celebrated them. The community that had stood up for me at the wedding, the military family that had supported and mentored me throughout my career, the friends and colleagues who had recognized my worth even when my biological family couldn't, these relationships had sustained me through the difficult years and would continue to enrich my life regardless of what happened with my family relationships going forward. Standing at the airport, preparing to return to my unit and my military family, I felt a sense of completion and new beginning that was both humbling and empowering. The scared, insecure teenager who had left Richard's house with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination to prove herself had evolved into a confident officer who knew her own worth and didn't need external validation to feel valuable. The family relationships that had once been a source of pain and insecurity were becoming sources of strength and connection based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The story that had begun with exclusion and rejection was transforming into a narrative of inclusion, healing, and hope. But more than that, it was becoming a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the possibility of redemption and reconciliation, even in the most damaged relationships. The minister who had called my name that day had done more than recognize my service. He had initiated a process of healing that was still unfolding, still creating new possibilities for connection and understanding. As my plane lifted off, carrying me back to the life and career I had built through my own determination and sacrifice, I carried with me not just the satisfaction of family reconciliation, but the deeper knowledge that I belonged to multiple families, multiple communities, multiple networks of support and affection that recognized and celebrated who I had become. The little girl who had once felt unwanted and unworthy had grown into a woman who was valued, respected, and loved by people who mattered. And that knowledge was a gift more precious than any wedding invitation could ever be. 5 years have passed since that transformative day at Emma's wedding, and the changes in our family landscape continue to surprise me with their depth and permanence. Emma and Marcus welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Grace, 2 years ago, and I had the profound honor of being present for her birth. Holding my niece for the first time, seeing her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I felt a connection to the future that transcended all the pain and separation of the past. Grace knows me as Aunt Sarah, the soldier who brings her books about brave women and teaches her to march around the living room while singing military cadences that make her giggle uncontrollably. At 2 years old, she already shows the kind of fearless curiosity that Emma and I had to fight to preserve in ourselves, and watching her explore the world with complete confidence in her own worth reminds me daily of what childhood should look like when it's nurtured with unconditional love and support. My mother has transformed in ways that continue to amaze me. The timid woman who once apologized for my very existence has become a fierce advocate for her granddaughter and a supportive presence in both Emma's life and mine. She left Richard 18 months after the wedding, a decision that shocked everyone who knew her, but that represented the culmination of months of therapy and gradual recognition of her own worth and agency. She lives now in a small apartment near Emma and Marcus, working part-time at a local nonprofit that provides services to women leaving abusive relationships. Her work gives her a sense of purpose she never found during her years as Richard's wife, and she often tells me that helping other women find the courage to leave toxic situations feels like her way of making amends for the years she failed to protect her own daughter from emotional abuse. "I see you in every woman who walks through our doors," she told me during my last visit to Portland. "I see that same determination to build something better, that same refusal to accept that someone else's opinion defines your worth. You showed me what courage looks like long before I had the strength to follow your example." Richard remarried within a year of my mother's departure, choosing a woman 20 years younger who seemed impressed by his financial success and social position. I felt nothing but relief when Emma told me about the engagement, recognizing that his need to control and dominate someone would now be directed toward a person who had willingly entered that dynamic as an adult. My mother's freedom was worth celebrating regardless of where Richard chose to redirect his attention. The military has continued to provide me with opportunities for growth and service that validate every sacrifice I made to pursue this career. I was promoted to major last year and selected for a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon, where I work on policy development for veteran transition programs. The irony is not lost on me that the woman Richard once dismissed as playing soldier is now helping to shape national policy that affects thousands of military families. My work focuses specifically on helping military members maintain family relationships during deployments and transitions, drawing on both professional expertise and hard-won personal experience to develop programs that bridge the civilian-military divide. I often think about how different my own family's story might have been if resources and support systems had been available during my early military years to help families understand and appreciate military service. The wedding that nearly excluded me completely has become a touchstone in our family narrative, referenced not as a source of shame or conflict but as the moment when we all chose to embrace our better angels. Emma includes the story in the speeches she gives at her social work conferences, using our family's journey as an example of how institutional bias and personal prejudice can be overcome through community intervention and moral courage. Minister Thompson, who initiated the chain of events that transformed our family dynamic, remains a close friend and mentor. He officiated at my mother's renewal of faith ceremony when she decided to return to active church membership after years of spiritual dormancy. He also blessed Grace at her baptism, a ceremony where I stood as godmother alongside parents who were determined to raise their daughter with the kind of unconditional love and support that had been missing from our own childhood. God works through ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Minister Thompson told me recently when I thanked him again for his intervention at the wedding. All I did was call your name and ask people to stand. You had already done the hard work of becoming someone worth standing for. The ripple effects of that wedding day continue to manifest in unexpected ways. Several other military families in our community have reached out to share their own stories of family conflict and reconciliation, finding hope in our experience that healing is possible, even in seemingly irreparable relationships. I've become an informal counselor and advocate for military members dealing with family rejection, using my own journey to help others navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of building bridges across ideological and cultural divides. Grace will grow up in a family that celebrates service, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right. She will know that her aunt served her country with honor, that her grandmother found the courage to leave an abusive situation, and that her parents chose love over fear when they had to decide what kind of family they wanted to create. She will understand that families are not just born but built through daily choices to support, encourage, and accept each other's authentic selves. Emma is pregnant again, expecting a son they plan to name David after our biological father, a decision that represents another step in reclaiming our family narrative from Richard's attempts to erase our history. This child will grow up knowing about the grandfather he never met, understanding that courage and service run in his family, and learning that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let others diminish your worth or potential. Looking back on that moment when Minister Thompson called my name and asked me to stand, I understand now that he was doing more than recognizing my military service. He was affirming the fundamental principle that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and included in the communities they belong to. He was insisting that families have a responsibility to celebrate rather than diminish their members' achievements, and that communities have an obligation to speak up when they witness injustice or exclusion. The scared young woman who sat in a rental car across from her sister's wedding, watching her family celebrate without her, has been replaced by someone who knows her own worth and refuses to accept anyone else's limitations on her potential. The uniform I wear represents not just military service but the choice to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, and to never accept that some people matter less than others. My story continues to evolve, shaped now not by exclusion and rejection, but by inclusion, acceptance, and the knowledge that worth is inherent rather than bestowed. The family that once failed to see my value has learned to celebrate it, and the community that stood up for me that day continues to provide support and encouragement as I build a life dedicated to service and integrity. Captain Sarah Mitchell became Major Sarah Mitchell, but more importantly, the excluded daughter became the beloved sister, aunt, and daughter whose presence enriches rather than threatens family celebrations. The wedding that was supposed to happen without me became the foundation for a family story built on courage, redemption, and the transformative power of refusing to remain invisible when justice calls your name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.